Hey, welcome back to Cool Classics. Today we're going to take a look at the life and career of Dan Blocker, best known for playing Hoss Cartwright on the Bonanza TV series, but there's a lot more to his story. I got some cool clips, some freaky facts. Here we go. He was born Bobby Dan Davis Blocker, December 10th, 1928 in DeKalb, Texas. Now, his birth certificate was filled out incorrectly by someone at the hospital that day. They put down Bobby Don Davis Blocker. His father was named Ora Blocker, but went by the nickname Shaq. His mother was Mary Arizona Blocker, maiden name Davis. On the day Dan was born, he weighed in at 14 pounds, which was a record for Bowie County, Texas, and stood all the way until a few years ago. Dan only had one sibling, an older sister named Virginia. Now, when she was 11 years old and he was 5, she fell ill with pneumonia and passed away. The following year, Dan's father sold the small family farm because the Great Depression had really made it not profitable for them. And with the loss of his daughter, he just wanted a whole new start. So he moved the 3 of them to O'Donnell, Texas. O'Donnell, Texas was another very small town, and to put it in perspective, as of 2022, its population is still just 726. His father wanted to start another business, and with the little money that he had left and the good credit, he went to the local bank, and they gave him a loan, and he opened a grocery store called Blocker. The grocery store was going to serve 2 purposes. 1, as the family business, and 2, as the family home. They actually lived in the back of it, and in the field behind the warehouse doors, that's where Dan played. That was like his backyard. Owning the local grocery store meant that the family was very well known in not just their town, but the surrounding towns also. When you came into the store, you were waited on by the family, and this included Dan. When he was just in 5th grade, he was already 5 foot, 5 inches tall, and strong. He had a lot of meat on his bones, they said, and he wasn't just bagging groceries, he was carrying 40-pound bags of cattle feed out for people that purchased it. As Dan got bigger, stronger, and more known around the community himself, Dan's father was worried that he was going to just follow in his footsteps and run the family business, which he didn't want for his son. He wanted more because the store was still a struggle. Some months they could barely pay their note off. So his father, Shaq, was secretly talking to all the other business owners around the area when they would come through, and he would mention to them that his son is very smart and should work for them in the future. So he was trying to build a separate reputation for him other than just the store owner's son. Now, people were looking at Dan as if he was this big, strong young man who was also pretty tough, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that the city would put on these festivals around 4th of July. During this festival, the city would actually put up a boxing/wrestling ring in the little park next to the grocery store, and people from the town could go up and put on an exhibition match. And in 8th grade, Dan entered up there in the wrestling and took on an adult from the town and beat him. And then later that day, he wrestled 2 grown men and beat them both. So that's how he kind of got the reputation as this tough guy. But the truth was, he was more of a gentle giant and highly intelligent. Had they been in a bigger city with higher advanced placement classes in school, Dan would have been in them, and he would have graduated early because everything he did, he excelled at in education. Now, his father, Shaq, knew this, and he wanted to make sure that Dan had the best chance possible at education. So he came up with the money and enrolled Dan at the Texas Military Institute. It's a college preparatory school, also nicknamed the West Point of the Rio Grande. And Dan took to the place with flying colors, becoming vice president of his class and beloved by everyone. During these years, Dan grew to be 6 foot, 4 inches tall and over 300 pounds. And again, he was known for his strength. But he also started playing football, which improved his agility. Then, when he graduated in 1946, he went to Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas, and there he also played football. It was during that first year of college that Dan realized that he really wanted to be a school teacher himself. So the following year, 1947, he transferred to Sul Ross State Teachers College in Alpine, Texas. And there he went on to play on their football team. While attending classes there for the next 3 years, Dan also needed to come up with some spending money, so he would work various part-time jobs, one of which was working at the rodeo. And when asked what jobs he did there, he said anything and everything that required being big and strong. Now, one of the other jobs was he would go and be a bouncer at a local bar. And he said it was a pretty rough place. I actually had to toss people out into the street. Now, can you imagine being tossed by Hoss? That's pretty cool, but also pretty dumb, get tossed out of the bar. Now, back in school, Dan was also working with the arts department, helping them build structures for their plays that they would put on, and he would also help them set the stage up. So one day he was asked if he would go down in the school's basement and help carry up the dummies to put on the stage because they weighed a lot and they knew that Dan could carry more than one at a time. So he went ahead and did that, and that's when he first met Dolphia Parker. He said, boy, did I fall instantly in love, but she didn't. It took some work on my part. Now, luckily, he did have a great personality, and he joined the drama team. So, performing alongside of her and being around her, he got to really show her who he was, and she fell in love with him too. In 1950, Dan graduated with a master's degree, and the two of them were going to head to New York and take on the world. But before they could do that, Dan was drafted into the United States Army to serve in the Korean War. He was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. After that, he was in F Company, 2nd Battalion, 179th Infantry Regiment in the 45th Infantry Division. He went on to achieve the ranking of infantry sergeant, and he did see combat where he was wounded and received the Purple Heart. He was discharged from the Army in August of 1952. There is a book out there that documents the 45th Infantry Division in Korea, and in there are pictures of Dan that are not anywhere online. So if anyone ever finds that book, please scan those pictures into Google and share them with the world. The first thing Dan did when he got home from the service was propose to Dolphia, and she accepted, so the two of them were married in 1952. Then in 1953, the two of them moved to Sonora, Texas, where Dan became the high school English and drama teacher. After a couple of years of teaching, Dan decided that he wanted to go do post-grad work at UCLA and get a job while he's out there. So the two of them moved to California, and that's where things start to get really interesting. The happy couple decided to start a family. On May 4th, 1955, they had their first son, David. And on July 31st, 1957, they had their second son, Dennis Dirk. That same year, Dan got his big break, unexpectedly. The young family had just pulled back into town from visiting family in Texas, and Dan stopped at a payphone so he could make a quick call. With the family sitting right there in the car, Dan goes in this phone booth and he's dressed in a cowboy outfit, from the hat all the way down to spurs on his boots. This man was walking past and noticed Dan in the phone booth, so he stopped and waited for him to finish his call. Then he asked Dan this question. "You wouldn't happen to be an actor, would you?" And Dan replied, "Of course I am," because he had been one in college. And the guy then asked, "Well, what set are you working on?" And then Dan came clean and said, "I was just kind of messing around. I'm not an actor." And the man said, "Oh, well, I saw your outfit and I thought you were filming a Western." The two of them start laughing and they go into a conversation, and it turns out this man is a talent agent, and once he finds out that Dan did do some acting in college, he says, "I think I can get you some work." So that's where it all began. In 1957, Dan appears in the Three Stooges episode Outer Space Jitters, playing a zombie.
Relax, I have perfect control. Hold. Back. Back. We have 1,000,000 more zombies just like him.
An army of those monsters could destroy the Earth.
Precisely what we are planning.
Yay! A corpus! Light some lights, quick.
Where? Oh, there.
buttons and anything.
A popular song title? Right.
Man, what a way to start your career. Now, did you notice he was billed as Don Blocker in that episode? That same year, 1957, the work just kept coming. He was in 3 movies. Black Patch, playing a blacksmith, uncredited. In Gunsight Ridge, playing a bartender, uncredited. And The Girl in Black Stockings, playing Mike, the bartender.
Packing them in heavy tonight, aren't you, Frankie? In mourning?
Fix the drink and shut up.
Now, Frankie. Then she'd get out there on that dance floor and really fry eggs.
I said shut up, Mike. Just shut up.
Not so touchy, boy.
The same year, he also appeared 5 times on television, all westerns, things like Colt 45 and what you see on the screen now, Tales of Wells Fargo. He said that his agent would send him out to these auditions and tell him beforehand, make sure you wear your cowboy duds. He said it seemed stupid at first, but it really did work. The casting agents worked on multiple shows, and they always remembered the great big tall cowboy guy, so they would give me a call.
Beats me what difference it makes how fast a man can load a wagon.
Make all the difference if you break an axle out on the trail.
Maybe a few of them Cheyenne breathing down your neck.
The next year, 1958, Dan blew up, and westerns were all the rage. There had to be over 20 of them on the air because Dan appeared that year on 16 different western TV shows, multiple times for each one. We're talking all the big ones too, like Sugarfoot, Cheyenne, Have Gun Will Travel, Wagon Train, Zorro, Maverick, The Rifleman, and the one you see now, Gunsmoke.
How about it? Any of you men see Porter's draw first? It's like you're in trouble, Burke. What about me, Marshal? I seen it. Ain't my word worth nothing? There's only one of you, mister.
Yeah, there's only one of him, but he's a good one. Now, he was on the Restless Gun TV series 5 times that year. Each time his character's name changed to something with a B. Burgerman, Burnett, Burland, Bruto, and this one, Buckstar.
You stay right here. I'll be back.
Pleasure me.
Look, you see that girl over there?
Are you sure that's a girl? Howdy.
Why, I declare, it can talk. Why, it must be human.
Mercy Day, this is Miss Rolly Akins. She's gonna make a lady out of you like your pappy wanted.
Let's take a look at you, honey. Well, there really is a girl under all that dirt. I'll give it a try. You go on over there, honey. We got work to do.
Put my mule up for me, you hear?
Yes, sir.
Wait a minute. You hear tell of a man named Vint Bonner?
Vint Bonner? He a friend of yours?
Stole my woman. It's the last one he'll ever steal. I'm looking for a slick-talking, woman-stealing man named Bonner.
Get Bonner, quick.
Dragon whiskey.
You asking for me?
You stole my woman.
I didn't steal Mercy Day, or any other woman. Her pa asked me to look out for her.
City. What they done to you?
Put Mr. Bonner down.
Man, I liked his character on that episode. And again, he was lifting somebody up in the air. If you've been paying attention to the pictures, you've seen him do that quite a lot. Now, back home in O'Donnell, Texas, everybody noticed that Dan was on television, and he would call back there every week and tell them what he just filmed, so they made sure they watched for him to appear. He was becoming a big hometown hero. He said the thing that surprised most of the people back in town was that he was always riding a horse. They'd never seen him do that before. So, a little bit later in 1958, he lands a reoccurring role on a new Western series called Cimarron City. And again, his character's last name starts with a B, Buttinger, but his first name is Tiny.
Howdy.
Good afternoon, Mr. Temple. Mr. Buttinger?
I don't think I know you.
Whoa, how come you know us? Heard of you two all the way into Kansas. You have? What'd you hear? Nothing but the best.
You're, ex-cavalry, aren't you?
Yes, sir, 21st Kansas Battalion. But I hung up my sword a couple of years ago. Now I'm just looking for work.
Looks like we just got all excited about nothing, Mr. Temple. That's what all these strangers doing in down here to work that cattle drive.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm not sure I'd trust that guy. Do you know who that was? That was Lee Van Cleef. And if you don't know who that is, well, you better ask somebody.
Tell me, what does this chicken look like, this Ruiz Gutierrez?
Early 40s, maybe. Dresses well. Might be considered handsome by the ladies.
Ugly men make better soldiers.
Now, Cimarron City ran from the fall of 1958 through the spring of 1959, 26 episodes total, then it was canceled. So Dan was back out on the grind, appearing on every show that was available at the time. But then he goes in for a new Western. This one was going to be a little bit different. It would take place on the Ponderosa Ranch with the father and his 3 sons. Now, all 3 sons had 3 different mothers who had all died or been killed in different ways. So, since the show was going to be based around 4 male lead characters, they needed each actor to be able to deliver their lines with believability. Because your character's story would not change. This would be serious acting with a little comedy thrown in and a moral conclusion to each episode. So after going through a long audition process, they settled on the father, Ben Cartwright, will be played by Lorne Greene. The oldest son, Adam Cartwright, would be played by Pernell Roberts. The youngest son, Joseph Cartwright, also known as Little Joe, would be played by Michael Landon. And the middle son, Hoss Cartwright, would be played by Dan Blocker. With the cast set on September 13th, 1959, NBC debuted Bonanza.
You done your lash?
What's the meaning of this?
We'll ask the questions.
Gentlemen, I wouldn't like to cite you into my court for threatening. You sit down.
You stay away from us, Lash. There'll be no land grab in the Ponderosa.
Next time your men start shooting at us, we won't be bringing them back to you alive.
Where's my son?
May I ask you, Mr. Cartwright, to address whatever questions you may have to my friend, Langford Poole?
Go home before I kill you?
You tell me to go home?
You have any argument, Poole? You don't have it with my father. You have it with me.
The Cartwright family stuck together, but there was a lot of sibling rivalry, especially between the oldest and youngest, which meant that the middle son, Hoss, had to step in a lot and be a mediator/bouncer.
Stand still when I'm talking to you. You're a Cartwright. Do you know what that means?
No, older brother. I'm waiting for you to tell me.
All right, I'll tell you. It means you got part of the responsibility of running this ranch, same as Pa and Hoss and me.
I didn't think I could handle it same as you. I quit.
New Orleans monkey pick you got handed down to you by your French Quarter mother?
Because I never been able to see myself being kin to anything whelped out of a thin-nosed, blue-blooded Boston Yankee.
Fire him, brimstone! Hoss, make him stop. Put an end to this shame, this disgrace.
Don't you worry none. I'll stop him. All right. You boys had enough fun for one day. Let's call it quits.
Yeah, he'll quit all right, Hoss. He hasn't the guts to take any man-sized punishment.
A lot of the characteristics of Hoss were the same as Dan in real life, and not just the ones about being big and strong, lifting men up and throwing them, being in backyard boxing rings, but the ones about him being a kind-hearted person who would go out of his way to help others. On the show, he was always sticking up for women, children, and the elderly that were being mistreated or picked on, and in real life, he was always for the underdog. I believe that most viewers were picking up on this themselves, and that's probably one of the reasons why he started to take off in popularity. They just knew that that was him on and off screen.
Mr. Cartwright, think I'll ever be big and strong like you?
I don't know, Benji. That sort of depends on how big your folks was.
My grandpa, he was a real big un, they say.
Well, in that case, Benji, you concentrate on it real hard, I'll bet you one of these days you'll make it.
I'll sure try, Mr. Cartwright.
One thing about Dan, he loved children. So him and Dolphia had two more, twin daughters, Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn. The happy family had it all, and the show was taking off, which meant that Dan's contract got renewed, and he got a pretty good raise. So the first thing he did was call his mother and father and tell them he wants to retire them. They need to move to California and live in a house that he's buying for them. At first, they didn't want him to spend the money on them, but he told them, I have it all under control and I want to do this. Please just come out here and live with us. So they agreed, and it was going to take a little bit of time. His father was going to stay back there and transfer the store over to a family member and teach them how to run it. Unfortunately, his father passed away just 3 weeks before he was to make the move. And 2 months later, the Bonanza TV show was #1 in the ratings, so it was a bittersweet time for the Blocker family. Now, as life went on, his mother was living with the family, the show was a big success, and Dan started to take this extra money and invest it in different ideas, and one of which was a steakhouse based off of the Bonanza TV series. After the success of the first one, he decides to open more, go nationwide, but to do this, he would need some partners. So who better to join in than his TV father and little brother, Lorne Green and Michael Landon. The three of them pooled their money together and started opening more locations. They would also show up at the grand openings and appear in the advertisements to try and generate a lot of interest, and it worked. Bonanza steakhouses were a huge success. Now, after a few years, the three of them did sell their shares and get out of the business right before it turned into Ponderosa Bonanza. And that's a whole nother story. I should make a video on that sometime. But the three of them, they made a lot of money off that deal. Think about that for a second. That's a testament to the character of Dan Blocker. If you can get other people that know you to put their money in a business with you, that means they trust and respect you and consider you an honest person. Now, back on the show, they had a tiger by the tail. It was a hit, #1 for 3 straight seasons starting in 1964, and it was in the top 5 for an unprecedented 9 seasons in a row. Bonanza went on to become the #1 television show of the 1960s, and it ended up becoming NBC's longest running Western. It went for 14 years, making it the second longest running Western in television history behind Gunsmoke, which Dan also appeared on. During this time, Dan focused mainly on Bonanza. He only appeared a couple other times on different things, such as the Tim Conway Comedy Hour, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, and a couple movies. You might know this one, The Cockeyed Cowboys of Calico County. But his main focus was always on the show that he loved. Now, during his time on there, he said that he had trouble with his weight fluctuating to up over 300 pounds. And each time that would happen, he would go on a diet and try and bring it back down. He wanted to be under 300 all the time, he said, but there's something about a 12-egg breakfast that just calls his name. Despite always being overweight, Dan never did have any health issues. It wasn't until early 1972 when he started to have abdominal pain. He ended up going to the hospital and they told him that it was his gallbladder and they needed to do surgery right away. So he underwent the procedure and they thought it was a success, but he ended up developing a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot, and he passed away on May 13th, 1972. This devastated his family, his friends, everyone on the show, and everyone that watched the show. Millions of people were in mourning. He was only 43 years old. With the show not having finished its 14th season, they didn't know exactly how to come back with another episode and not have Hoss in there. They didn't want to make a funeral episode or one where he dies because they didn't want to do that to the public, have them grieve again. The episode is called Forever. I don't want to spoil it for you, but they did it very tastefully and very impactfully. So impactfully that each episode after that had less and less viewers, ending the show in its 14th season. The following year, 1973, back in O'Donnell, Texas, for their annual 4th of July celebration, they unveiled the Dan Blocker Memorial. It was placed next to the Blocker family grocery store in the little field that Dan played in as a child. It reads, "Thanks to film, Hoss Cartwright will live, but all too seldom does the world get to keep a Dan Blocker." His mother was in attendance for the dedication, and across the street at the old bank where the family got the loan for the grocery store, that is now the Dan Blocker Museum. Also, his children grew up to have happy, normal lives. His daughters have stayed out of the public eye, but his son David Blocker is a film producer, making movies such as Trouble in Mind with Chris Christopherson, all the way to the Hannah Montana movie. His son Dirk Blocker probably looks familiar to you. He's been in a lot of television shows. I know him from the Brooklyn Nine-Nine series. And both boys have appeared in everything Bonanza related or has something to do with honoring their father's legacy. I'm now going to leave you with a little story about a man who met Dan Blocker. The man said that he was 18 years old and had just been drafted into the Vietnam War. He had went and spent some time with some family members and he hopped a plane to go report for duty. On there, he was seated next to Dan Blocker. Now, he knew who he was. He was afraid to say anything at first, but as the flight went, the kid was really nervous, and it showed, and Dan spoke to him first. As the conversation goes on, Dan finds out that the kid had just been drafted, and he was nervous. So Dan tells him, "I myself was drafted into Korea. I understand what you're going through, and being scared, being nervous, that's okay." Dan then asks the kid, "Do you want to have a beer with me?" And the kid says, "I'm not old enough." And Dan replies, "I didn't ask you if you were old enough." The kid says yes. Dan gets 2 beers from the stewardess, hands one to the kid, and they talk for the rest of the flight. He said the way Dan talked to him reassured him that everything was going to be okay. And Dan told him, "When you get back, you look me up. I'll remember you and we'll have another beer." Now, the man goes on to say that he thought about that experience the whole time he was in Vietnam, and he was determined that when he gets back, he's going to look Dan Blocker up and have another beer with him. It gave him something to look forward to. When he finally landed back in the mainland, before he could even get debriefed, that was the same day that the news hit that Dan had passed away. I shared that story with you because I really felt that it showed the true colors of Dan. In that moment, he felt like he wanted to help that kid in some way to make it back safe. He knew what he was going through. Also, in case something bad did happen to him, he wanted him to have his first beer. I'm sure that Dan knew that his words were having an impact on that kid, and I'm also sure that Dan would have loved nothing more than to have that kid walk up to him a couple years later and remind him that he was the one on the plane. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. I only make them on people that I like, and Dan is right there at the top of the list. Take a second, hit subscribe. You may never find this channel again if you don't. It's easy to get lost on YouTube, but I will be back in the future with more cool classics.